This message is entitled A Reason and Purpose for Everything. The existence of God, who He is, and how He saves. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." An innumerable number of people, including many who do not even believe in the existence of God, have an unshakable, heartfelt belief that everything happens for a reason and a purpose. That, quote, everything has a reason and that reason has a purpose, end quote. Many who have no particular spiritual preferences or convictions whatsoever surprisingly wax lyrical over their ardent belief that there is a reason and a purpose for everything. The generalization, "it's going to work itself out," is often heard in the wake of such claims, as well as the equally mindless, "everything happens for the best." These thoughtless phrases are usually spoken when one has no real solution to a problem. How can events work themselves out? And how can events conspire of themselves to make the future turn out for the best? How can problems with no known solution ever work themselves out? How do they do that? Why do people say such things? And why are so many, perhaps the majority of people from various cultures across the globe no less, so deeply convinced that there is a reason and purpose for everything? Is it all just superstition or optimistic thinking? Is it something that people just say in order to encourage and give hope to the forlorn? Or is there more to this conviction than just mere subjective thinking? Is it just a matter of people being so fearful of life and its consequences that they attempt to console themselves with some mysterious, unprovable, yet to their minds unchallengeable truth, that everything inexplicably always works out for the best? That we do not live in a purposeless, meaningless world, but that we are here for a reason. Simply because one is still alive, still eating, and with a roof over one's head and clothes on one's back is no evidence that all has worked itself out for the best. If everything always worked out for the best, then the best would always triumph. But what would be behind everything always working out for the best? And who would define it as the best, when one man's idea of the best is viewed by another man as the worst? Hindsight often provides evidence and confirmation of a reason and purpose behind all things. The connecting lines between past events in one's life provide insight into why such beliefs as there is a reason and purpose behind all things and everything working out for the best are firmly adhered to. People look back on events in their lives and see how this could not have happened if that had not occurred, etc. They see that a seemingly innocuous decision they made in the past actually caused a domino effect which set off a rhythm or chain of events that all conspired to lead them to a life-changing moment, or how a last-minute change of plans made a lifelong difference to their lives. Through such sequential events, they begin to see the reason and purpose for everything, and therefore everyone. It is quite ironical that those who are foolish enough to believe the lie that there is no God, see Psalm 14 verse 1, nevertheless eagerly subscribe to the belief that somehow there is rhyme and reason behind every event that befalls mankind. That there is some unexplainable pattern, some meaning to life's very existence. The phrase, "there's a reason for everything," is often heard in our daily conversations, yet most people do not think past this quite perceptive comment. I once asked a lady who shared with me her firm and considered opinion that everything happens for a reason, and that there is therefore a purpose for everything, what such a belief might suggest to her. She stood searching in vain for an answer, and eventually conceded, saying she did not know. I informed her that if there is a reason and a purpose for everything, would that not strongly suggest to her that there is someone behind the reason and the purpose? Would this not only prove that there is a God, that there is a grand design and therefore a great designer, who is in complete and sovereign control over everything and everyone? What people who believe that there is reason and purpose for everything need to come to terms with is the fact that there could be no reason and purpose, therefore no ultimate end, logic or sense to anything in life, indeed to life itself, if there was no God. If there was no God, there would be nothing. No cause behind any rhyme or reason to anything in life. There would be no logic behind any reason to or no purpose for life if no cause behind reason and purpose existed. Reasons and purposes do not form themselves. They do not come about of themselves, for these are things which must be willed, planned, and formed by an intelligence prior to an occurrence or event in our lives. Reasons and purposes may only be seen and realized after the event, but no event can ever precede the reason and purpose for it, just as an effect can never precede its cause. If there is a reason for everything and everyone, then there must of necessity be a purpose behind the reason, and logically someone, some ruling, all-powerful, overwhelming and irresistible governing and architectural force behind both the reason and the purpose. There cannot be reason beyond purpose, for purpose is what motivates reason. Reason is the cause of an event, and, quote, purpose is the reason for which something is done or created or for which something exists, end quote. Everything which exists has a cause behind its existence, therefore a reason and a purpose for its being. Nothing which exists can be without purpose and reason. There cannot be reason without purpose or purpose without reason, for both are mutually reliant. Reason often reveals the purpose, and purpose is the cause behind reason. For instance, the reason the door was opened was because I purposed to walk into the room. Therefore, my purpose led to the reason why the door was open. Why the door opened. Indeed, why I opened the door. Without reason and purpose, nothing could exist. Without motivation, without mind, nothing would be. An organisation cannot exist without purpose. So too, one cannot have leadership without purpose, and that purpose itself cannot be without a reason. The purpose for something done reveals the reason behind why it was done. But what motivates what lies behind the reason for the purpose of all things. Purpose is the birthplace of reason. But what is the birthplace of purpose? Everything has an origin, a beginning. So what is the origin for the purpose behind everything and everyone? Will. Every purpose has a will behind it, and will cannot exist without mind. If there is no God, but nevertheless a reason and purpose for everything, meaning antecedent to everything, where would the reason and purpose come from? What would be the source for every reason and therefore purpose for all things? From where would every reason and purpose, cause and motivation derive its source if there is no God? Who would be behind the reason and purpose for all things? What would be the origin of reason and purpose, and who would be the author of it all if there is no God? Who or what would attach reason and purpose to every one and everything? Do reason and purpose exist only in our minds? Are we the parents of reason and purpose? Does reason come from purpose, or does everything find its purpose in the reason for its existence? Are reason and purpose merely illusions, summoned by a mind which desperately seeks acknowledgement and justification for one's existence? Or are we to stretch our imaginations to the breaking point and try to convince ourselves that reason and purpose are all governed by mere chance? Does the orderly reason and purpose for all things come from the chaotic aimlessness of alleged randomity? Is the meaning to life something which just comes out of thin air, by happenstance? If life has no meaning, then there can be no reason for or purpose to anything in life. Is everyone and everything just one big meaningless accident which nonetheless has reason and purpose, which is determined by the unknowable? Those who have been taken in by the universal lies of the Big Bang theory and evolution, both designed to convince people that there is no reason and purpose to anything, and therefore no God, that might is right and natural selection, which came to be defined as survival of the fittest, rules the day, see no problem with the belief that all is chaos, with no real reason or purpose for anything. As we shall see, it cannot be mere chance which is behind reason and purpose, for there is abundant and irrefutable evidence which shows there is intelligent design behind everything, from the ant to the atom, from the Ulysses butterfly to the universe. If there is design, then there must also be a designer. And one cannot have a designer without intention, without that designer's will. Without a will, there cannot be intention. Without intention, there can be no purpose. And without purpose, there can be no reason, and therefore any meaning to anything. In fact, nothing would exist. If there is no meaning to anything, then everything would be without purpose and reason, intent and will. How can there be will and intent to a universe that has no reason or purpose behind it? If there is no reason or purpose for man, then his will and intentions would have no consequences. If, however, there are consequences, then it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is order in and to the universe. If there is no God, then there can be no responsibility. Furthermore, quote, if there is no God, murder isn't wrong. You may think it's wrong, but how do you know it's wrong? Without God, all morality is mere opinion. In a secular world, there can only be opinions about morality. They may be personal opinions or society's opinion, but only opinions. Every atheist philosopher I have read or debated on this subject has acknowledged that if there is no God, there is no objective morality. End quote. Indeed, there would be no objective morality or immorality, for everything would be subject to the rule of opinion and consensus. One man's opinion would be as good or as bad as another man's opinion. Quote, if morality is intrinsic to humanity, then amoral human beings either do not exist or are only deficiently human. End quote. If there was no God, then the only motivation anyone would have for law and order would be self-preservation, fear of punishment, staying out of prison, etc. But then again, why self-preserve when life is alleged to have no meaning? Where does man's instinct to stay alive come from? And why, for that matter, keep oneself alive if there is no purpose to, therefore no reason for life other than the immediate fleeting moment? Why the intrinsic universal instinct to survive at all costs, only to eventually die? That such an instinct exists in all creatures proves that survival at all costs is at least one reason to the purpose of life. But what is the reason and purpose behind this survival at all costs mentality? Quote, if there is no God, there is no immortality. And what is the consequence of this? It means that life itself is absurd. It means that the life we have is without ultimate significance, value, or purpose. End quote. If there is no God, there can be no purpose, and therefore no reason to or for anything or anyone. If there is no God, then everything would mean nothing. The whole reason and purpose for everything would be absolutely nothing. Everything would have no significance at all, for without reason and purpose, nothing would have any meaning. If everything is without reason and purpose, then there would be no order to life. And if no order, then all is chaos, utterly without cause and therefore pointedly absurd. There would be no consequences, adverse or otherwise, if there was nothing but meaningless chaos. Reason and purpose introduce the theme of consequence. If there is no purpose for life, then there is no purpose, no meaning, and no reason for anything. If there is no reason, then there can be no significance. For how can something be of any significance without there also being a reason and purpose for it, and therefore design and meaning to it? There is nothing to learn from or understand about anything if there is no purpose behind it all. What would the reason be in learning anything about life if there is no meaning for life? Reason, purpose, and meaning are the heart and soul of significance. Without these three elements, significance would be without meaning, and so without reason, purpose, or meaning, it simply could not exist. Let me read that again for you. Without these three elements, significance would be without meaning, and so without reason, purpose, or meaning, it simply could not exist. If there was no reason, purpose, or meaning, nothing would have any importance or be of any consequence, and everything would be confined to meaninglessness and insignificance. If there is nothing which has any significance, why bother with morality and a society governed by law and order? If there is no God, there can be no governing universal law, no order, no reason, no purpose, and no meaning to life or for life. Quote, "Without God, we therefore end up with what is known as moral relativism, meaning that morality is not absolute, but only relative to the individual or to the society. Without God, the words good and evil are just another way of saying I like and I don't like." End quote. Moral relativism is another way of saying do what you want, which is, interestingly enough, precisely the philosophy of infamous Satanist and 33rd degree Freemason Aleister Crowley, whose motto was, quote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." End quote. In fact, this statement, or should I say self-destroying philosophy, first encouraged by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, see Genesis 3, denies the rule of God, nay, the existence of God or of any gods who would dare to proclaim how any man should live. Those who follow such a liberal humanistic philosophy fail to realize that the demigods they are listening to, such as Mr. Crowley, are doing exactly what they say no God has any right to do. They are dictating how man should live his life. They are saying, do not obey any law but the law of disobedience. Do not obey any law except the law we are telling you. In essence, they are not saying do what thou wilt, but rather do what we tell you. In the world of the anarchist, all must be chaotic. A world dominated by everyone doing whatever it is they want to do. Mobocracy without bounds. Do what thou wilt dictates that there must not be one rule for all to obey except for the rule of do what thou wilt. For each and every man has, they say, the right to be a law unto themselves. Man can do what he wants, as long as what he does conforms to the demigod's definition of what do what thou wilt is. Does do what thou wilt include believing in the true and only God? Is serving and worshipping the true God, which includes denying that any man has any right to do whatever he wants, part of this satanic philosophy? Serving the true God is diametrically opposed to serving oneself or anyone or anything else. Quote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," sounds awfully like the code of the psychopath. End quote. Than the basis upon which to build an orderly, structured and safe society. Do what thou wilt encourages murder, rape, violence and every kind of perversion, all in the name of freedom. Freedom without boundaries is in reality enslavement to sin. There seems to be an end, a goal involved in such a philosophy as do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, as well as an inbuilt note of rebellion in its tone. If there is no reason, purpose or meaning behind anything or anyone, then there would also be no point, no end or goal in living any kind of life, including doing only what you want to do. Nothing would have any purpose or desired result, and so there would be no point at all in living any particular lifestyle. Quote, "Do what thou wilt, then, is the axiom of any who choose the left-handed path of internal authority rather than the right-hand path of external authority." End quote. But why choose any path if there is no reason or purpose to life? Why have any rule, law or governing principle in one's life, no matter its origin, if there is no meaning to life? Why set your life on any path when life itself is totally without meaning? People would not need to be told to do whatever it is they want to do if there was no meaning to life. Let me repeat that. People would not need to be told to do whatever it is they want to do if there was no meaning to life. If all were chaos, do what thou wilt would be the congenital philosophy of everything and everyone. For whose other will would there be to fulfill if there was no God, and therefore no meaning to anything at all? Why would anyone need to be told to do whatsoever they wanted to do if there was no God? Incredibly, do what thou wilt is looked upon by some as the law of freedom. Freedom from what or whom, we may well ask. Man's doing what he wants, like smoking cigarettes or drinking as much alcohol as he pleases, or taking any other drug, often leads to addiction, sickness, and death. Nothing is without consequence. Consequence is the true gauge by which we can judge the veracity and legitimacy as well as the practicality of thoughts such as do what thou wilt. Often called the dean of science fiction writers, Robert A. Heinlein basically restated do what thou wilt when he wrote, quote, "I am free no matter what rules surround me. If I find them tolerable, I tolerate them. If I find them too obnoxious, I break them. I am free because I know that I alone am morally responsible for everything I do." End quote. But morally responsible to whom, Mr. Heinlein? To oneself or to others? But why be morally responsible at all if there is no God, and therefore no reason, purpose, and meaning to anything? Do what thou wilt has no intrinsic morality or cares for any consequences in its outlook. In fact, it has no outlook other than living for oneself and serving each and every lust that comes to mind. Self-gratification at all costs would be the only rule of life. Essentially, when one rules out the existence of God, all one is left with is having oneself as God. Scripture states that God is in the heavens, he hath done whatsoever he hath pleased. Psalm 115 verse 3. The so-called law of freedom, which claims that man may do what he wants, is an attempt to have man be the one and only God in his life. Do what thou wilt makes each individual their own God. This was essentially what the serpent told Eve in the garden. Satan told Eve, "Ye shall not surely die." Genesis 3:4. Encouraging Eve to eat of the fruit, Satan introduced the fundamental concept of do what thou wilt instead of heeding God's word. Satan sweetened the pot, as it were, by adding, "Ye shall be as gods." Genesis 3:5. Being one's own God is evidenced by one's living a life according to one's own perspective, always placing oneself first above all others, one's own thoughts above another's wisdom, being convinced by the unspoken promise that such an existence is true freedom. Satan convinced Eve that obedience was not the way to ultimate happiness. He was not so much advocating disobedience, though this of course was what underpinned his motive in deceiving Eve. But what he was trying to do was to convince Eve that doing what he wanted her to do would be her doing what she wanted to do, and was what true freedom is all about. However, there is no freedom in addiction, so it is not surprising that do what thou wilt can hardly be considered as the key to the law of freedom. doing what you want invariably leads to addiction, a servitude to sin. True freedom requires boundaries. Such boundaries do not restrict but protect the one seeking true freedom in life. Here we have structure, and behind every structure, be it material or moral, there is a designer. Why seek to be a decent, upstanding society governed by law and order, which would be based on nothing but subjective, subject to change opinion, if everything around us is without reason? If there is no God and man is a law unto himself, his own God, whom are we trying to impress? And where does the motivation, the sense for all this law and order come from? Whatever prompted man, who, if we are to believe the evolutionist, is merely an organic product of chaos and disorder, to seek order in his life and in society as a whole? Where does this idea and desire for order and structure come from? If there is no God, then the sum and substance of man's existence is governed by pure chance, an organic accident, if you will. If all that life holds for each and every one of us is inevitable and unavoidable death, then let us all eat, drink, and be merry, for all that tomorrow will hold for any one of us is nothing but the constant, ever-present, realistic prospect of an eventual, impending, and indomitable deprivation of existence. Death would be the ultimate overlord, the exclamation point to an existence whose only meaning would be found in its cessation. Death would be the ultimate God, for the only sense to anything or anyone's existence would be found in the fact that all are spiraling toward death. The only point to life would be death. The only point to being born would be the commencement of the dying process. The only point to life, the only thing that would make any sense of life, would be cessation of life. It is a truly blind man who sees and knows that he does things for a reason, and that there is purpose to his doing them, but who cannot see any reason or purpose for his being. How can there be reason and purpose for what we do, but no reason or purpose for why we are? Reason and purpose intrinsically lead to an end, and so must also have a beginning. These things cannot be without a goal. Even animals do things for a reason and a purpose, with an intended goal in mind. Some would reply, animals just do things by instinct. But instinct, quote, an innate, typically fixed pattern of behaviour, end quote, cannot be without reason and purpose. And if that is the case, where did instinct come from? Instinct did not suddenly come into existence, nor did it evolve. For how can anything have existed without the instinct to survive at all costs, right from the very beginning? Who fixed the pattern which each animal would evidence by its actions? Instinct cannot be without order and reason, and therefore it must necessarily serve a purpose. A life without purpose would be a life without a cause, and therefore a life without origin, an originating source. Many people are convinced that life's ultimate end is pleasure, that the only thing that makes any sense of life is to lead a sensually self-indulgent lifestyle and to seek it at all costs. But why pleasure? Where does this often sinful urge for incessant delectation come from? And why do we often derive more pleasure from those things which the general consensus of society frowns upon? At best, all man can do is to temporarily prolong life, a life we all know is unstoppably careering toward death. We can attempt to slow its progress toward its inexorable end, but we can never stop life reaching its terminal point. Despite the euphoria that accompanies each life-saving medical procedure, doctors can, at best, only forestall the inevitable. Increasingly, people try to live as long as they can by eating healthy and watching their weight, etc. Books, DVDs and television programs, all designed to provide the means and methods devised to obstruct death and provide a better quality of life, abound. The health and wellness industry is tipped to be the next trillion-dollar industry globally. As of December 2016, fitness, exercise, healthy eating and weight loss sales reached a staggering $667 billion. But if there is no reason to existence and no logical reason for and therefore no sense to life, why the lifelong battle with death? Why wage a war on death with a life that will eventually and unavoidably succumb to it? Why the effort? Where does this desperate vital urge to stay alive no matter what and prolong a life which has no reason or purpose come from? And why does such a morbid fear of death exist in a vain world allegedly filled with utter meaninglessness? Why not simply embrace death? Ironically, the existence of death shows that there is at least one reason to life: to forestall death. But if there is no purpose to life, why the fear of death? And why the lifelong struggle to keep it at bay? Why do those who do not believe in God fear death? For if God does not exist, death would simply be a cessation of existence. So what is there to fear when one is no more? What is there to fear in a situation where one does not even exist? Could it be that man, who is so certain that there is no reason or purpose to life, fears what will happen after life? That death so feared will reveal the truth? Many do believe, at least in the element of the unknown, when it comes to death and what happens after death. Most try to live as long as they can. But why? They try to cheat death at all costs, but again, why the effort when death will eventually win the day? What drives us to stay alive? What could the motivation for longevity be to a life which purportedly has no meaning, reason or purpose? And what is this unknown element of death that motivates man's constant struggle with it? If death is oblivion, why does man fear death at all? What has nihilistic thought ever done for mankind except to not merely deny reality, but the reality of truth? Nihilism's denial of everything is based on the lie that everything is nothing. Quote, "The earliest philosophical positions associated with what could be characterized as a nihilistic outlook are those of the skeptics. Because they denied the possibility of certainty, because they denied the possibility of certainty, skeptics could denounce traditional truths as unjustifiable opinions. When Demosthenes, circa 371 to 322 BC, for example, observes that what he wished to believe, that is what each man believes, he posits the relational nature of knowledge. Extreme skepticism then is linked to epistemological nihilism, which denies the possibility of knowledge and truth. This form of nihilism is currently identified with postmodern anti-foundationalism. Nihilism, in fact, can be understood in several different ways. Political nihilism is associated with the belief that the destruction of all existing political, social and religious order is a prerequisite for any future improvement. Ethical nihilism, or moral nihilism, rejects the possibility of absolute moral or ethical values. Instead, good and evil are nebulous, and values addressing such are the product of nothing more than social and emotive pressures. Existential nihilism is the notion that life has no intrinsic meaning or value, and it is no doubt the most commonly used and understood sense of the word today." End quote. The problem with the philosophy of nihilism is that everything is nothing except nihilism. Everything is relative, unjustifiable opinion, except nihilism. Nihilism, like everything and everyone, simply wants to be God. Nihilism denies even the possibility of knowledge and truth, except the knowledge and so-called truth of nihilism. All order must be destroyed, according to nihilism, except its dictatorial iron rule over all else. Nihilism rejects even the possibility of absolute moral and ethical values, whilst protecting its own form of morality and values. Nothing has any value or meaning in the world of nihilism except for nihilism itself. Nihilism is the great totalitarian dictatorship in its purest form. It, quote, promises plenty, gives nothing, then takes everything. End quote. Nihilism promises truth, gives you anything but truth, and leaves you with absolutely nothing. Nihilism is the great dictator which says nothing is of any worth except for itself. Nihilism is a self-defeating philosophy which no rational person could ever accept. One man has observed that nihilism's law is, quote, only the untrue is true, end quote. Moreover, nihilism's claim is that only meaninglessness has meaning. Another has commented, quote, is it objectively true that nothing is objectively true? The phrase nothing is objectively true is seen as logically impossible to assert. End quote. How can one make an absolute statement believing it to be an absolute truth which denies the existence of absolute truth? Why does man continue to strive against something which he ultimately cannot stop? Why does man try to live a valuable, purposeful, meaningful life in a world which he believes has no value and therefore no reason or purpose to its existence? This man did this, but he eventually died. This doctor discovered a cure for this illness or that disease, but why bother when there is no cure for death? He lived a great life in service to his country, to medicine, to science, to sport, to the arts, etc. Big deal. What difference does any of this make to a creature that will ultimately lose its tentative grip on life? Where would the rhyme and reason for life come from if there was no creation and no controlling sovereign creator? Where would the rhyme and reason for decency, morality, law, order and organisation come from if all is relative, including morality? Are we to believe in the alleged importance of vainly living a good life only to eventually be launched into oblivion? If we are just carbon-based organic matter, why all the rules? Nihilism advocates, quote, a social arrangement based on rationalism and materialism as the sole source of knowledge and individual freedom as the highest goal. By rejecting man's spiritual essence in favour of a solely materialistic one, nihilists denounce God and religious authority as antithetical to freedom. End quote. Nihilism eventually deteriorated, quote, into an ethos of subversion, destruction and anarchy and by the late 1870s a nihilist was anyone associated with clandestine political groups advocating terrorism and assassination." End quote. Are we to allow ourselves to be swayed by a collection of particular moral values, of doing good rather than evil in a life which allegedly has no meaning or purpose other than death? And why, for that matter, would a good life be any better than an evil one in a morally relative, empty world which has no meaning? Quote, "If God does not exist, there really is no foundation for objective moral values and duties. Nothing would really be objectively good or bad, or right or wrong, if God does not exist. All our actions would lack objective moral meaning. Every act would be morally neutral. If God does not exist, that's all that morality is. Not an objective reality, but a matter of personal taste and preference, an illusion." End quote. Where does the reason and purpose for a good life come from? It's better to be good than bad. Be a good boy. Be a good little girl. Be good. Why? Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Why not? If reason and purpose do not exist, who is to say what is good or evil? How does one defend absolutely that which is only subjective? People say, well, evil hurts people. Granted. However, those performing the evil actually enjoy it. It makes them feel good. So who is to say that being good does not also include doing evil? In a world where morality is subject to what each individual says it is, who is to say that the pursuit of pleasure and happiness cannot also include hurting or even killing others? If the pursuit of pleasure and happiness are the order of the day in a nihilistic world, where does anyone get the notion to regulate how a person derives pleasure and personal happiness? Why set up restrictions and barriers to a person's pursuit of happiness, when the pursuit of happiness, according to many, is all there is? I mean, if the pursuit of happiness includes the murder of a child yet in its mother's womb, why bother with any petty restrictions such as speed limits on roads or laws preventing cruelty to animals? If the pursuit of happiness is the order of the day, then everything must fall into line with what a man wants to do in his pursuit of said happiness. Law simply cannot be turned to or even legitimately exist in the world of nihilism. Who determines what is good or evil in a world without reason? What is the standard? Where do laws come from? Why does man feel the compulsion to cocoon himself within a world of laws, from the sports field to city streets, if there is no such thing as absolute truth? It all comes from man's clear view of the incessant need for order. Every free society requires boundaries. People call all this civilization. But pray tell, what is so civil about a democratically elected government's sanction of the murder of an unborn child? There is no objective, absolute rule against murder in many so-called civilized countries except the murder of beings who have left the womb. Many so-called laws merely make room for what man truly desires, what he wants. Many of man's laws are actually created to protect his sinful and often wanton desires. There are laws in many countries now which allow and even condone sexual perversion, and many which condone assisted suicide for the terminally ill. The madness and paradox of relative objectivism cannot be avoided. People say you're on earth for a reason. How do they know? Who exactly determined this, and where is their evidence? Is this all just man trying to vainly make sense of a series of events he calls life? A series of events that is said to spring from and amounts to nothing more than mere meaningless coincidence. If there is no God, where did all this come from? How can there be reason and purpose to all things in a universe that either had no beginning or for which there was no reason? If there is no God, then there can be no reason or meaning to the existence of anything or anyone, and therefore nothing upon which law and order, decency and respect can be based, other than the ever-changing winds of personal and public opinion. If there is no meaning to life, why then do so many spend their time searching for it? Where does this need to know, understand, and search for a meaning to life come from, if there is no reason for life? If it does not have an intelligent source? If everything and everyone is merely the result of a sudden and unexplainable bang? People have travelled overseas to visit Indian gurus and the like in search of spiritual guidance and meaning to life. They have abandoned careers, sold their belongings, left wives, husbands, and children, all in search of the meaning of life. Is this the last vestige of religious, superstitious man before he evolves into a creature that simply accepts only what he can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch? Has man simply deluded himself into thinking that there is a reason for being? If there is no reason or meaning to life, where has this belief that there is meaning for everything come from? How can the very concept of meaning and reason find its way into a person's mind in a world which allegedly has no meaning and reason for its existence? How did reason, meaning, and purpose ever get into a meaningless man's mind? Quote, modern man thought that when he had gotten rid of God, he had freed himself from all that repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had also killed himself. For if there is no God, then man's life becomes absurd. End quote. Look at today's youth. For the most part, they are completely aimless, filling their time with instantly gratifying, mindless video games, eating and drinking the worst possible foods, many of which are loaded with sugar, whilst some others have copious amounts of caffeine, society's start-up drug, while mesmerized by countless digital display units from their iPhones to iPads and computer screens, obsessed with selfies and everything that encourages self-absorption and the delusion of self-importance. The world which they have inherited is one of ever-increasing narcissistic hedonism. Things which were once pastimes, like a video game or even a phone call to a friend, have become full-time obsessions. So much of the music they listen to and produce either spews forth words of hate and of the inaneness of life, or floods their minds with interminable fluff-filled pop songs, where the word love is used ad nauseum and substituted for the word sex. Add to this the increasing menace of illicit drugs, especially the dreadful new synthetic drugs, not to mention the increased dependency on prescription drugs and painkillers, and you have a recipe for absolute mayhem and despair. Some have a desire to try to make sense of the world they have been born into, but have no idea how, for they are even more spiritually bankrupt than the preceding generation was, which has virtually taught them nothing but to live for pleasure and seek material success and happiness at all costs. Much of what the preceding generation has taught today's generation is nothing but contradictory, hypocritical rubbish, which today's youth quickly dissects and sees through as lacking any sense or objective fact, hence their nihilistic outlook. They are just told to adhere to a certain acceptable lifestyle. Go to school, go to work, get married, have children, have grandchildren, play lawn bowls or bingo, then die. What for? Why this rigid schedule if there is no meaning to any of it? If there is no meaning or purpose for anything? Why the procreation of children when all of life is a meaningless sojourn toward death? Many are controlled and programmed by the unspoken edict, work, buy, consume, die. Why all this discipline and order in a vain attempt to give reason and purpose to a life which many believe to be meaningless, when death is all that awaits a man, no matter what his lifestyle is? To what end would each and every event serve in our lives? What purpose would there be for life itself if there was no God? Is life merely about relative significance, but not ultimate objective significance? What would lie behind any reason and purpose for everything that occurs if there was no God? If, however, everything does have a reason and a purpose, then what reason and purpose is there for the very existence of reason and purpose? What is the origin of reason and purpose? Is it chaos, or is it order? Surely, quote, organisation requires an organiser, design requires a designer, and information, as in DNA, requires an author. The findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. End quote. Those words come from Arthur Flew, Professor of Philosophy, former atheist, author and debater. Quote, languages only ever come from an intelligence, and information only ever comes from information. DNA cries out that there's an intelligence behind life. It couldn't have happened by chance or random processes. Matter on its own could never produce DNA. All the same formulas and communication theory that created our modern digital age apply to DNA too. In fact, many methods that are commonplace in the information technology field have been adapted and applied to genetics research and the Human Genome Project. DNA is not merely a molecule with a pattern. It is a code, a language, and an information storage mechanism. All codes we know the origin of are created by a conscious mind. Therefore, DNA was designed by a mind, and language and information are proof of the action of a super intelligence. If there is reason and purpose, then there must also be design, and therefore a premeditated plan behind the design, and consequently a planner or designer. In addition, if there is plan and design, there must also of necessity be thought, motive, and intention. Quote, motive is the moving power which impels one to action for a definite result, whereas intent is the purpose to use a particular means to effect such a result. End quote. Neither motive or intention can exist without thought, and therefore without mind. If all this is true, then it cannot be mere coincidence, time and chance which gave birth to and oversees our lives, our very existence. There must be an intelligent creator, And if there is a creator, then there is reason and purpose behind creation and every living thing. Reason and purpose imply order and design. So too, order and design essentially demand reason and purpose for existence, which in turn implies an intelligent source. To say that order and design cannot be without intelligence is to state a truth. However, to say that intelligence came out of nothing but time and chance, or that order and design do not reflect intelligence, is to show oneself an unmitigated fool, for evidence of design is overwhelming. Everything has an intrinsic element to it, a core which it cannot exist without. So what is it that reason and purpose cannot do without? A reason for something or someone cannot exist without there also being a reason for the reason. Purpose is the motivating factor behind a cause, but what is the reason or cause for the purpose? Surely reason and purpose cannot appear out of thin air. They cannot produce themselves, therefore they too must have a source. What lies behind the reason for anything? What is the basis for every reason? Surely it is that from which it originates, for the reason for anything cannot exist without a starting point. Everything triggers something else. So what is the trigger point for life itself? As effect cannot exist without cause, so too cause itself cannot exist without a preceding cause. What is the cause behind the cause that caused the effect, and why? Simply because something is the cause for something else does not preclude it from also having a cause or trigger. Trace every individual fallen domino back to the preceding domino until you get to the first domino. To think that the first domino fell by its own volition, or that it alone was the cause behind all the other dominoes falling, is to be limited or restricted, blinkered in one's thinking by only looking at the dominoes. A suitably intelligent investigation will always lead you to the person who not only knocked the first domino over, or was the cause for its falling, but why they set up all the dominoes in the first place, and the reason behind their wanting to knock them all down by flicking the first domino. Everything is traceable to its original source. If there is no reason, then there can be no cause, no purpose, and therefore no sense and no origin to anything at all. If there is no reason and purpose, then all that remains is futility, and a myriad of questions left unanswered. However, if there is order and purpose, the evidence for which is all around us, then there must of necessity be someone with an extraordinary and all-powerful intelligence and wisdom behind the design and order of all things, and the purpose for each and every one of them. Have you ever noticed how those who do not believe in the existence of God have never been able to understand the reason and purpose there is to life? They either debate endlessly about it or discard the subject altogether. Some say that we are all here to help others, or at least to do no one any harm. Without realizing what they are saying, they have just applied meaning to an existence they insist has no purpose. Most foolishly or perhaps wishfully conclude that pleasure is the fundamental, ultimate and only purpose for existence. They reason that if there is no purpose to life, then why be miserable? Live and be happy, for tomorrow we die. Adopt a hedonistic lifestyle, for nothing else matters but self-gratification. Quote, Hedonism is a school of thought that argues that pleasure and happiness are the primary or most important intrinsic goods and the proper aim of human life. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a well-known phrase in the United States Declaration of Independence. Ethical hedonism is the idea that all people have the right to do everything in their power to achieve the greatest amount of pleasure possible to them. Ethical hedonism is said to have been started by Aristippus of Cyrene, a student of Socrates. He held the idea that pleasure is the highest good. François-Marie Arouet, known by his nom de plume Voltaire, pardon my French, was a French Enlightenment writer, historian and philosopher. He's quoted as saying, "Pleasure is the object, duty, and the goal of all rational creatures." End quote. If the pursuit of happiness is man's sole goal in life, why? Why is happiness the alleged goal of all rational creatures? In this subjective, godless world filled only with that which is said to be subjectively relative, why is not misery the ultimate goal of mankind? Why not the pursuit of pain? Some people are never happier than when they are miserable, whilst others morbidly derive pleasure from pain. The pursuit of happiness is quite a broad brush which paints pictures that vary from people enjoying fun at the beach to those who actually derive pleasure from pain, both receiving and administering it. Many people derive pleasure from the unthinkable, from merciless torture to the killing of complete strangers. Is pleasure, whatever that may entail and however it is reached, the God that we should all bow down to? One person on the other end of the scale has poignantly written, quote, "For a while now I've been pondering what's the point in going on. Life is horrible, and why should we struggle through it just to achieve death? It would be so much easier to die soon, rather than waiting till death of old age. I find myself just waiting for an accident to happen. I want to kill myself, but I can't because it wouldn't be fair for the people who care about me. It would be too selfish. But I feel I exist only because others want me to. We weren't given a choice to exist. I can't see a point trying at anything. It doesn't make sense. People pursue happiness, try to make their lives better, but I can't see the point when we are just going to die anyway. I've tried finding reason, but I still can't find it. There is no reason for anything. I hate just suffering through life." End quote. See Ecclesiastes chapter 2. These are very sad words indeed by one who obviously has not factored God into the equation of life and the reason for life. I believe many people feel this way, but never have the courage and honesty as this person did to voice their frustration at a life which to them ultimately has no reason and therefore no purpose. Kings and beggars both meet the same end. Many good people die young, whilst those who cause great harm to others live well into their old age. In contrast with those who believe this proves there is no justice and therefore no reason and purpose to life, there is a reason why both kings and beggars, good and evil, ultimately suffer the same fate. Everyone knows that we live and then die, but few there be who realize that there is an actual reason, a cause behind death, which goes far beyond any organic malfunction. More on this later. If there is a reason and purpose to life, then the elephant in the room must surely be whose purpose? How could there be a reason for anything if the reason had no origin? If there was no one behind the reason? If there was no cause behind the reason's existence? If there was no one behind the establishment of, motive for, and the intention behind the reason and the purpose? A reason for anything could not exist were it not for orderly planning and design. How then could anything exist without an underlying motive, reason, and purpose? Everything has a reason and a purpose behind it. If it exists, then there must be a reason, a cause for its existence, and if there is reason, there is purpose, and therefore there must be someone behind the reason and purpose. Otherwise, where would reason come from? And how could it conceivably exist when even reason requires an origin and a source? If a wall exists, then it surely serves a purpose. It was surely built for a reason. If it is a painted wall, there is a reason behind its particular colour. Likewise, if there is a tree, then it too serves a purpose. Multiple purposes, in fact. And if its leaves are a certain colour, or if it produces a certain fruit, then there is a reason behind its colour and fruit being a particular shade or type. The colour and fruit do not come by accident. There are specific reasons for the colour and the fruit. How can there be someone responsible for the colour of the wall, but not the colour of a tree? How can someone be behind the colour, but not the existence of the object? Imagine seeds not producing after their own kind. How would we know what to plant? Reason and purpose are not born out of chaos and disorder. Order does not appear out of thin air, and it would be the height of irony if order were produced by disorder. As with anything, reason and purpose simply cannot be without a source. There is a cause behind every effect. Therefore, quote, nothing without a purpose can be an agent. With agents, action is permanently built into the world. Without agents, there's no reason for anything to happen. So the advocates for non-agency, that is scientists and atheists, have to appeal to random miracles to get things going, because otherwise nothing would get going at all. No one ever has or ever could observe a random event, an effect which has no cause. No one ever observes a non-pattern, a chaos, incompatible with any conceivable mathematical description, and no mathematical description, when properly ontologically and analytically considered, is ever uncertain in any existential way. Randomness is wholly non-empirical. People who support randomness have no evidence or proof that randomness exists. But randomness is all you have left once you have dismissed agency, subjectivity, teleology, meaning, design, and mind." End quote. The rolling of dice is not a random event. The reason why two people who have rolled dice invariably end up with different numbers is not something produced by randomity, chance, or accident. If the rolling dice were to be filmed and the film played back in slow motion, one could trace each particular roll, turn, bounce, tumble, and twirl, etc., which would determinedly logically end with the particular number on top once the dice had stopped rolling. Quote, "The effects of gravity, air resistance, friction of the table, and other factors influence the outcome of the roll, as well as the initial position of the die. Friction is important. With a high friction table in which the dice can't slide across very easily, the dice tend to bounce around more times, tumbling and twirling, and making the results harder to predict. With a smooth, low friction or soft table, the dice tend to bounce fewer times." End quote. Every resultant number is the product of the way the dice were thrown, the amount of strength used behind each throw, and the exact path with all its ups and downs, twists and turns the dice takes. It is quite simple to predict which way a dice will turn if footage of it is slowed down. In real life, it seems as though it is all randomity at play, but when the film footage is slowed down, we can easily see and predict what happened and what will happen next. The same goes for the toss of a coin. Whether it's heads or tails is predetermined by how much force was used in tossing the coin, how high it reached, how much force with which it landed, what surface it landed on, etc. Each element can be traced, and the result would be the sum total of all the above agents involved. Simply because it is impossible for a man to know precisely how much force to use, which would result in heads or tails, or a 6 or 1, does not mean that the force used plays no part in determining which side of the coin will face upwards or which number will finish on top. There is agency and cause behind everything, even to that which to the human mind appears totally random. Quote, "It's inevitable for materialism and atheism to arrive at randomness. If God didn't make the world, if agents didn't make it, if minds didn't make it, then what did? It made itself? It didn't make itself for any reason, since there are no reasons without God, agents, or minds. So it made itself randomly, accidentally, by chance, indeterministically. Once you have embraced materialism and atheism, once you have dismissed an eternal order of God, agency, or mind, you have no alternative but to claim that existence jumps out of nothing for no reason and proceeds meaninglessly, purposelessly, and without agency. Exactly all the conclusions scientific materialism has actually arrived at." End quote. Seriously, what sounds more implausible? Everything coming from something, or everything coming from nothing? Quote, "The fundamental problem for science is that it's logically impossible for something to come from nothing at all, for existence to spring out of non-existence." End quote. Or for a dice to roll itself, or for a coin to toss itself into the air. Quote, "It's a fundamental repudiation of the principle of sufficient reason, the eternal truths of reason, mathematics, all eternal, necessary laws, and all laws of conservation. Science claims that religion is about ridiculous miracles and absurd magic. In fact, no subject is more steeped in absurd magic, so-called miracles and impossibilities, than science itself. In terms of its ultimate claims, science is absolutely predicated on things happening for no reason, via no mechanisms. Incredibly, science considers itself a system of rational explanation. But how can chance and accident rationally explain anything?" End quote. Chance and accidents are explanations you have when you don't have explanation. Quote, "They are the denial of explanation. They are non-explanation. No reason, hence no explanation can be given for them. You just have to accept them and shrug your shoulders. The most basic principle of the ancient Greeks was that something could never come from nothing, non-existence. Science insanely rejects this foundational ontological principle. Its hatred of God and mind has led it to conclude that impossibility is to be preferred over the principle of sufficient reason." End quote. To attempt to explain the explainable with non-explanation, with explanations that have no evidence which will support them, is an excursion into madness. To explain that which is by claiming its source to be that which is not, exceeds even beyond the limitless boundaries of insanity. Chance and accidents as attempted explanations for effects have no basis in truth. They are empty vehicles which offer no rational, logical explanation for anything. They exist because they are said to exist. They are the cause of the causeless, simply because they are said to be. The absence of substance and the presence of nothing do not explain anything. The true Christian has faith in fact, not fantasy. Even chance occurrences and accidents have an originating source or agent, a reason behind why they have occurred.